ਇਹ ਗੱਟ ਗੱਟ ਕਰਕੇ ਜੀ ਕਰਦਾ ਪੀ ਜਾਈਏ ਠੇਕਾ ਮਿੱਤਰਾਂ ਦਾ ਆ ਬਹਿ ਕੇ ਮੂਡ ਬਣਾਈਏ ਵੀ ਠੇਕਾ ਮਿੱਤਰਾਂ ਦਾ
Okay. So I'd like to begin my presentation by acknowledging that we sit on the ancestral unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone people, whose presence and partnership we honor here at Stanford. I started with that clip. Sorry, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. I started with that little audio clip kind of to exemplify what I'm going to be talking about today. As you heard, it was a Punjabi folk song. And there were a common motif in this folk song was alcohol use. So today I'm going to be giving you a brief overview on Sikh perspectives on alcohol. So in the scriptures, a history of mood-altering substances. So on the Indian subcontinent, Punjab, and the diaspora. I'll give you some reasons for why problem drinking has been hypothesized to persist in the diaspora. So mostly I'll be talking about Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And then I'm really going to be talking about the culture as one of the reasons given for the persistence of problem drinking. And then I'll focus on Sikh masculinity in particular. So quickly, the Sikh perspective on alcohol is it's strictly prohibited. One of the perhaps goals of Sikhi is to move from the path of the Manmukh to the Gurmukh, and alcohol is something that prevents this from happening. So on the Indian subcontinent, mood-altering substances are often used for medicinal purposes, such as cannabis, opium, and are used as pain relievers. If we move to Punjab, opium, alcohol, and cannabis have been outlined as the main mood-altering substances. The use of opium is often associated with agricultural work and the increase of opium during harvesting months because of the strenuous labor that occurs. And then if we think about alcohol in particular, landowners display their prosperity by entertaining guests with alcohol. Alcohol, especially imported liquor, is viewed as a status symbol among the landowners and is a part of the social elite life. However, for the working class, alcohol is used to self-medicate the pain from the strenuous labor. So some reasons for why this occurs, to some extent, the culture endorses the use of alcohol as a part of Punjabi masculinity. So in the contemporary context, I would point to Bhangra music as endorsing this. It also plays an influential role in the socialization of Punjabi males. They internalize the cultural belief that alcohol consumption is indeed an aspect of their masculinity. And then if we move on to the diaspora, various studies, particularly one conducted in the UK, point to Sikhs as the most regular drinkers and reported more alcohol-related problems than the white men and the Hindu men, who are also delineated as regular drinkers. Research has also suggested that Sikh men drink on average more spirits than any other ethnic group and are more likely to drink alone and at home. In a survey of second-generation individuals, it was reinforced that Sikhs are the most regular drinkers and have more alcohol-related problems. With the exception of Sikh men, there were high levels of abstinence reported among younger Asian people, and this was in the second generation. Among South Asian religious groups, it is generally more acceptable and commonplace for Sikh men to drink than in any other South Asian religious groups. Sikhs are also the most regular drinkers at 3 times or more per week. And a recent study indicated that an increased number of Sikh men presented with alcohol-related liver disease. So why does problem drinking persist in the diaspora? So these are some reasons that have been outlined. Perhaps the liberal attitudes toward alcohol consumption when you come to a Western nation, the acculturation-related stress, so migration from a collective traditional society to an individualistic modern society, so moving from the collective nature of the Punjab to the greater anonymity of your host country. Furthermore, the second generation is trying to navigate living between two cultures, so the tensions that come with that. It's also commonly believed, or is sometimes commonly believed, that alcohol helps a man work longer and harder. And then kind of bringing it back to what I was talking about before, the social drinking that forms a part of the Punjabi male bonding culture, so that's transmigrated to the diaspora. And then what I mainly want to focus on is the culture. So the idea that the culture endorses the use of alcohol as a part of Punjabi masculinity. So the two things I'm going to be focusing on is this concept of the culture and the concept of masculinity, particularly Punjabi Sikh masculinity. So dominant explanations for why problem drinking persists in the Sikh community focus on culture, and they frame the community as hyper-patriarchal, hyper-traditional, but addiction is not an issue that's specific to the Punjabi Sikh community. It's all pervasive, and it affects many different communities, cultures, and religions. So through an anti-colonial lens, today we're going to be investigating the construct of culture. So those are both important terms to keep in mind, the construct of culture, and that I'm looking at this through a colonial lens. So yeah, we're going to use an anti-colonial lens to investigate the construct of culture, tradition, and custom. They can be understood as colonial constructs that create master narratives depicting communities as backwards or traditional, and ultimately they advance of white privilege. And to quote, "There is nothing natural or primordial about cultural identities, religious or otherwise." So to blame the culture serves a colonial system. People forget the social relations, the political identities, the political forces that are complex, that are never fixed. They're always interacting. Culture is not static. So this takes us to the idea of the culturalization of racism. So instead of speaking of race or class, we talk about cultural or ethnic differences. So we're kind of shifting the language, but the essential message stays the same. So to quote, "By creating a system whereby natives were ruled by customs and not rights, there were no limits to power in their communities as there would be in a civil society." So that's so since pre-colonial societies did not have single customary authorities, for example, tribes or clans, colonizers would choose which individuals or which groups to point to sanctify as native authorities. And they declared that this version of custom was genuine and sought to construct native custom as unchanging and singular. And also these practices or these groups that they delineated as the ones who were practicing the true culture, these were often those within the community that were privileged. So to take it to independence, independence was viewed as a way to go back to the way that things were before colonization, to the authentic culture and values. However, there's no such thing as authentic culture, as it's always changing and static. It's practiced differently in different areas and regions, but there was only this authentic culture that was given authority over other ways in which culture was practiced. So to bring it to the diaspora, ideas such as multiculturalism and diversity, which have been so embraced in Canada, and perhaps I can extend this to the United States as well. So multiculturalism and diversity has been fully embraced by Western nations. However, to quote, "When a society officially declares its commitment to plurality, it does so as a defense against the real demands that empowered minorities could make in such a democratic system. Demands based on racial injustice and class-based oppression, all things the Canadian state wants to avoid." It serves Canadian nationhood better to reduce the demands of systematically marginalized groups to simply cultural demands. So this again reiterates the culture of the colonized people as constructed as static and unchanging, and then therefore immune to history, in contrast to Western culture, which is seen as progressive and always on the path to modernization. So amongst diaspora communities, it has been I'll share some discourse with you. So in diasporic communities, when people of former colonies come to the West, essentially, or it could be argued that they are recolonized. Quote, we put ourselves back into socio-political spaces closely resembling a colony. So in an effort to resist assimilation and in an effort to gain power in spaces where power is limited, they adapt cultural differences that the state has previously used to other them, and they use it to create a collective identity, one that has to be in opposition to Western culture and modernity in order to give legitimacy. So again, this positioning of ethnic cultures as traditional and then Western cultures as modern also obscures the great misogyny of Western society. So the realities of the constant struggles around class and gender back home are obscured, and the discourse of colonized countries as backwards is continued. Furthermore, it's been suggested that we may not actually know that much about our culture as we think we do, but when we're given the position of native informant, in which we're placed in a place of authority because of membership in a community, we reiterate that idea of culture. However, in all of this discourse about the construction of culture, I'm not calling that we throw out the culture. I call that we think about the construct of culture through history and the effect that it's had in the contemporary context. So as much as as important as it is to acknowledge the construct of culture through a colonial lens, and that Western culture is equally as patriarchal and misogynistic, we also need to be able to talk about our own patriarchs. And then to link this to masculinity, I'd like to talk about Punjabi masculinity in particular. So the way that these systems influence men. So patriarchy hurts men as well. It teaches them to feel shame when they do not live up to expectations of masculinity, to deny their feelings, to repress all emotions except for fear and rage. To quote Bell Hooks, if patriarchy were truly rewarding to men, the violence and addiction in family life that is so all-pervasive would not exist. So quickly, perhaps people are familiar with looking at masculinity through a colonial lens, but I'll give a brief overview. In the way that patriarchy has been developed and manifested through Sikh history, the colonial British rule was central to the creation of this masculine and militant Sikh identity. As a mechanism of ruling, the British claimed affinity towards the Sikhs, so they likened themselves to the Sikhs as they were a masculine and warrior-like people, and they contrasted this warrior-like identity with the Hindus, who they declared were effeminate. So it's kind of perpetuating this notion that of this hyper-masculine notion, which was primarily perpetuated through disproportionate recruitment of Sikhs into the Indian Army. So it's a promotion of a hyper-masculine identity that they liken to themselves. So they also argued, or it has been argued, that this masculine persona was innate in the Sikhs. They pointed to the baptism practices of the Sikhs, the kirpan, the turban. All of these culminated to advance the idea that the Sikhs were a masculine people. So how does all of this connect? Essentially, what I want everyone to leave with is to ask a question, is to think about this question. So how has alcohol become associated with this elite warrior image, which will help us understand why alcohol continues to be a symbol of status and wealth for Punjabi Sikhs today. So I started off by giving you a little overview of alcohol use in in Punjab, in the diaspora. Then I went on to talk about some reasons for why it may persist in the diaspora, of which I found it particularly important to talk about culture and to talk about masculinity, as it does disproportionately affect men. So when we talk about alcohol abuse in the community, I think it's important. When we perhaps simply blame the culture, I think it's important to think about what we're doing, what it means when we think about the culture, and then also in a similar lens, think about the construct and the performance of masculinity and why it's linked to alcohol use, and perhaps that will help us. That'll give us a nuanced understanding of the issue. Thank you.